Happening, folks? After watching 2022's X and its almost immediate sequel, Pearl, Mia Goth and Ty West had me doing frickin' carpet zoomies up and down my hallways. I thought both movies were bold and unique, and they each had their own very distinct style. And as a result, like a lot of other people, I suppose, I was very excited to see part 3 in the trilogy. And now that it's finally here, let's just say this time I won't be doing any carpet zoomies. We'll be breaking the movie down into 3 acts, and as usual, I'll be throwing in my 2 cents worth as we go along. Oh, one thing though. After writing the script out 2 full times, I've had to accept the fact I can't analyze this movie properly without contrasting it directly to parts 1 and 2 in the series. It'll make more sense as we're going along. And if it doesn't, then I'm just going to have to explain myself in full detail later on. This is Ty West's Maxine. The movie opens in Los Angeles in 1985, which is about 6 years after the last time we saw Maxine speeding away from the carnage that brought the movie X to its conclusion. While Los Angeles and half of the country is terrified by the murders of Richard Ramirez, the infamous Night Stalker, we meet Maxine Minx as she's auditioning for the lead role in a new horror film called The Puritan 2. Naturally, her reputation as an adult film star precedes her, but her acting is so effective she lands the part anyway. And after sharing the news with her friend Leon and colleague Amber James, Amber invites Maxine to a party in the Hollywood Hills, but Maxine declines because she's to work her second job in a peep show that night. When she gets there, a mysterious leather-clad figure watches her while clenching his fists and making fans of the old Giallo murder mysteries feel a tad nostalgic. Then she bumps into another adult film star friend named Tabby Martin, who also invites her to the same party, but she declines this invitation as well. As Maxine walks home, she takes a route through a back alley and notices somebody is following her. She arrives at a gate by the street only to find it locked with a big chain. When she turns around to double back, a shadowy figure who happened to be performing outside on the street earlier corners her with a switchblade. But right when she looks doomed, she surprises her would-be attacker with a gun. She points it at the man and orders him to strip naked and lie face down on the ground. She then brags about the fact she crushed the head of the last person who tried to kill her. Then she stomps directly on his man parts, and Ty West gets a super tight shot of it to make sure none of the men in the audience will be sleeping that night, or maybe for a few nights after seeing it. Back at home, the same shady figure from the peep show leaves Maxine a police evidence videotape containing the adult film Maxine and her now deceased friends tried to make 6 years ago during the X movie. The first act is brought to an end when a suddenly agitated Maxine asks her friend Leon to find out exactly where the tape could have come from. So far, in terms of hitting the requisite story beats, this first act does introduce us to the main characters. It also establishes the 80s setting and the movie's sleazy tone. It sets up the story's main conflict by showing us Maxine's past has finally caught up with her. And the problem, as I see it so far, and it is a subtle one, is Maxine herself. Now, of course, the golden rule with sequels and prequels is the story has to be able to stand on its own 2 feet first. But given the popularity of the series and the fact all 3 movies came out within such a condensed time period, you have to assume a large portion of Maxine's audience is going to be aware of Maxine's backstory already. And if you accept that suggestion, which you should, having Maxine openly bragging about a past she's desperately trying to distance herself from feels like a step backwards and downwards for Ty West. The last time we saw Maxine in X, she surprised us with her resilience and her ability to tap into a survival instinct she didn't even know she had. I suppose I have trouble accepting the idea a mere 5 years later she's devolved into some kind of shallow grandstanding quip machine. And besides, on this channel, that kind of thing, well, it's my job. Here's Act 2. Meanwhile, way up in the Hollywood Hills, Amber and Tabby become the first slasher victims in this faux slasher film, and their bodies are branded with satanic symbols. And then, Maxine's invited to meet with John Labatt, a private investigator who tells her crimes will be revealed to all unless she meets with the person who employed him to find her. He instructs her to appear at a specific address on Starlight Drive later that night, or she'll face the consequences. The movie's police officers, LAPD detectives detectives Williams and Torres then question Maxine about Tabby and Amber, given she's a known friend to both of them, but she refuses to cooperate under the pretense she does not speak to police officers. At her next appointment, Maxine realizes Labatt's been following her, so she loads her fist up full of car keys and goes to town on his face and neck. She advises him rather vigorously to keep away from her, but he vows to get her back for what she's done now that she's just made this whole thing personal. Ignoring Labatt's blackmailing, Maxine gets to work learning her lines for her new leading role in the horror film Puritan 2. While she's doing that, her pal Leon's done in by the shady figure back in the adult video store he works in. The next day, as Maxine's observing the ruckus outside, the detective pulls a cheeky move to gauge her possible involvement in the murder. But when she pulls the sheet back, it is obvious Maxine had nothing to do with it. The detectives do their best to goad Maxine into cooperating, but she sticks to her uncooperative guns. Instead of telling the LAPD what's happening to her, she confides in her agent, Teddy Knight, instead. And Teddy tells her he couldn't find any information on Labatt, the private investigator, but he assures her he'll make sure everything's sorted out for her. And then, on the set of the Puritan 2, Maxine meets the star of the Puritan 1, Molly Bennett. She mentions a similar party in the Hollywood Hills later that night. And not long after meeting Molly, Maxine bumps into Labatt, who's wandering around the backlot of Universal Studios. Furious from the previous day's exchange, he chases her all over the place with a loaded gun, only to be caught by a security guard who escorts him away from the actual original Psycho House. Later that night, Maxine tricks Labatt into following her, and then her and her agent and a big scary friend of theirs ambush Labatt and knock him unconscious. And after watching this scene close up in slow motion and as high a resolution as I could muster, I can say this is one of the best practical effects I've seen in years in terms of believability. Labatt wakes up handcuffed to his steering wheel under the business end of a junkyard compressor, and after they exchange pleasantries, Maxine's agent turns Labatt's lights out permanently. And this leaves Maxine free to investigate the address Labatt gave her to find out who hired Labatt to find her in the first place. When she gets there, she finds Molly's hacked up body in a suitcase. And the second act is brought to a close when she discovers the murders were not, in fact, committed by Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, but by her estranged father, a televangelist named Ernest Miller, with the help of the fundamentalist members of his twisted Christian ministry. If a movie's going to do well, a lot of things have to happen during the second act, which accounts for about half of the movie's runtime. We need to see a deeper explanation of the characters' motivations. We need to see the characters growing or shrinking in response to the story events. The characters' circumstances have to get complicated so everything becomes more progressively challenging for them. And as the second act is wrapping up, if it's not too much to ask, it would also be freaking lovely if we were all at the edges of our seats in anticipation of Act 3. Despite them being two very different movies, both X and Pearl were written efficiently and full of thematic depth. But Maxine mixes clunky elements of Hollywood's sleazy underbelly and a serial killer wannabe giallo-style murder mystery and a watered-down critique of the Hollywood process itself, all into one big messy attempt at a plotline. And on top of all that, the Maxine Minx most of us came to see, the one who more than earned herself the final girl title in X, appears to be totally lost now. Somewhere back in the 70s, maybe. Instead of carving her way through this plot, dictating the actual story with her thoughts and her actions, she's sitting in the audience watching things happen, just like we are. When she goes for her first big audition outside the adult film industry, she not only gets the lead role, she beats out dozens of actual actresses. When they introduce Kevin Bacon's character to complicate things and crank up the tension, she just dispenses of them a few times. And it's not hard. This is not the character we met in X, and it's not a character I would pay to see in a movie. But not to worry. I'm confident Ty West is about to totally redeem this series and himself as the writer and director in this third and final act. I mean, The House of the Devil was amazing. And not just because I want to pick Jocelyn Donahue up and put her into my pocket to protect her from all the Hollywood creeps. The third act opens with Maxine's father revealing he and his followers have been filming the murders to create a sort of snuff film in hopes of exposing Hollywood's sinful and corrupt nature. Believing he can still save his daughter, Miller has his followers tie Maxine to a tree for an impromptu exorcism, which he also films. Detectives Torres and Williams interrupt the ceremony at the last minute, kicking off a Hollywood-style shootout that kills Miller's followers and injures Miller himself. In all the mayhem, Maxine's able to free herself from the tree before the detectives are mortally wounded during a chase sequence with her father, the serial sinner. Armed with a shotgun, Maxine confronts her dad at the foot of the Hollywood Hills sign, but she's interrupted by instructions from a police officer in a helicopter. Maxine slips away momentarily into a daydream about herself as a celebrity credited for helping to finally stop this ruthless killer, her father. In the daydream, she's attending the premiere of The Puritan 2. During an interview, she imagines the movie's director announcing she'll be directing a biographical film about Maxine's life next. When she comes back to reality, she shoots her father in the head, telling him he gave her exactly what she needed to make it in life, that being some sort of divine intervention. The movie ends a month later with Maxine continuing her work on the Puritan 2 film, expressing her hopes the current level of fame she is enjoying never, ever comes to an end.
You must be judged!
As I mentioned, X and Pearl were very different movies, and they were praised for very different reasons. But they shared some core strengths, and I'm going to start with those. Both X and Pearl had very strong identities in terms of the subgenre. X paid homage to the abrasive slasher movies of the 1970s by combining raw, grindhouse aesthetics with a more modern sensibility. Conversely, and unexpectedly, Pearl flipped the table over by presenting a character-driven horror drama with a hand-painted Technicolor vibe most of us naturally associate with the earlier days of Hollywood. Both approaches resulted in a unique and compelling viewing experience for we the horror fans. Both X and Pearl also featured compelling characters brought to life with remarkable acting. Mia Goth's performances in both movies were hailed for their vulgar intensity and their realistic complexities. Her portrayal of the titular Pearl, a disturbed young woman with twisted dreams of stardom and an adorable smile, came with an unexpected layer of emotional depth not typical to these sorts of films. The earlier iteration of Maxine in X had the same unhealthy obsession with fame and fortune, but her circumstances were wildly different, as were her motivations. Thematically speaking, X explored that all-too-busy intersection between sex and violence in horror movies, while Pearl pointed its cameras at its themes of ambition and repression and even mental collapse. Ty West managed to integrate these themes perfectly into the narratives, and they complemented both movies' abundant horror elements. Now, if it sounds like I'm focusing on the wrong movies in this review, it's because I am. The truth is, pointing out Maxine's failures is easier than presenting what it did well. Despite its promising premise, not only as a standalone movie, but as the conclusion to this very strong trilogy, Maxine ended up coming across like an overly ambitious, convoluted story from an amateur director. It tries to blend several complex elements into one narrative while pushing its titular character's drive and motivation down a dark alleyway. When we first meet Maxine in X, she's compelling and interesting and alluring and deceptively innocent given the nature of the film they're making. Half the fun in that movie was watching her shed those last thin, naive layers in order to make it out of the story alive at all. As our new protagonist in Maxine, she seems unchanged by the story events. Traditionally, if the protagonist remains neutral by not changing for the better or the worse over the course of the story, the characters around them are expected to change. And in that way, as the saying goes, your main character changes by not changing at all. But none of the supporting cast were developed beyond their names and job descriptions in this movie, making them very M. Night Shyamalan, don't you think? Clearly, Ty West put a lot of effort into recreating this movie's 1980s era, but none of it felt like anything beyond a style choice. Don't get me wrong, it was well done, and I'd be lying if I said the soundtrack didn't get me up out of my chair more than once, but that does not serve the story. It's essentially bright neon pink nostalgia without any of the narrative depth of the previous two films. Overall, I think Maxine failed because it was too ambitious. In trying to be so many things at the same time, it lost the tight its storytelling and the pacing and the character focus that made X and Pearl so compelling to me in the first place. Maxxine had its moments here and there in terms of gore and the special effects, but even some of them were cartoonish. And while I am certainly not saying this movie's put me off Ty West in any way, Maxxine's total lack of impact as a story was wicked disappointing for me. And even more so when you consider this is the exact same guy who had me doing carpet zoomies up and down my hallway 2 short years ago. If you've seen Maxxine already, let's talk about it down in the comments. If you've got any thoughts on the trilogy as a whole, I would love to hear those as well. As always, my friends, thank you very much for watching. I have already got the next video lined up with a first view reaction, and it's a doozy. Until next time, folks. It's me, Johnny, from that video you just watched, although I'm sure you know who I am, right? You should subscribe to the channel. It doesn't cost anything, it's easy to do, and it makes creative people like myself who thrive on compliments feel all warm and fuzzy. And if you like that last video, click on this next video because it's just as amazing. Click on it.